Yeah, big news, obviously. Big news yesterday breaks. Not only the Tyler Lockett was released, I think that was anticipated and expected with a $17 million relief in cap. But the other big news yesterday, DK Metcalf says, I want out. I want to trade. How do you react to that headline?
I was trying to think it through. I had a couple of people texting me last night that are still in the league, and I was trying to think it through a little bit last night and go, he's 27 years old. Last year was contract, making $18 million. First thought in my head was he wants more. And then I started to think recent events this week in Seattle, you've cut 5 veterans to save over $40 million in cap space. Geno's on his last year. He's 35 years old. There's no real answer behind Geno at this point going forward. So is it more that the young man's concerned about competing now? And I'm not there. You guys probably have a better feel. But when I put my GM hat on, those are the kind of things I think about. Like, okay, he's 27, it's 18. He's in line for a new contract at some point. That's point number one. Point number two, how important is being competitive now to this kid? And then number three, I put the John Schneider cap on, and I go, okay, if we were to move him, which I'd rather not because he's a really good football player, but if we were to, then what can we get for him? And if you look at recent comps in the wideout market over the last 2 or 3 years, they're all over the board. Mm-hmm. And you can see comps in the first round play. I think AJ was a 1 and a 3 from the Eagles, I believe. Mm-hmm. So you can start to hang your hat on different comps that are out there. But really a big piece of this for whoever would potentially trade for him is what does the contract situation look like, and can we come to an agreement now prior to executing any kind of trade? Because if I'm going to give up a second-round pick or whatever I'm going to give up, I want to make sure I have this 27-year-old young man locked up for the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Can you help me understand that? Mike Mayock with us, obviously years and years and years at the NFL Network as a broadcaster, stepped out of that to be the GM of the Raiders. So can you help me and Mike and our audience understand when these trades, because you went through them, are proposed and you start to broker that deal, when do the numbers of with the agent of that player that's being traded, is that done before the trade is consummated? Or can you, as an organization, the Seahawks here, say, no, we're going to trade you, second round pick, good luck, go find that deal after the fact, after the trade is made with the numbers?
I think what happens in the real world when general managers talk privately is that whoever the acquiring general manager is just going to say, hey, John, look, I'm okay with a 2. As long as you give me permission to talk to the agent and I know I can structure something long-term. But if I can't structure something long-term, then it's not worth a 2 to me because then I'm just renting him potentially for 1 year.
So who would be interested?
I don't know the answer to that. I think there's all kinds of, because there isn't much in the wide receiver free agent class, and because the draft wide receiver group isn't as deep as usual, I think there'd be a long list of suitors.
You were telling me the other day, Mike, you went through, and so far you're 3 or 4 rounds deep as far as your evaluations in this draft of these players. Is there a wide receiver at 18 that you would say if the Seahawks were to move on from DK and are moving on from Tyler, and if this guy and this receiver is at 18, it would be an unbelievable grade in value?
Here, Brock, here's my problem is that, again, GM hat on, looking to the future. You don't just look to this year. You look to the next 3 years minimum. And I go back to your quarterback situation and your offensive line situation. And to me, prior to getting excited about any wideout, I think 2 things have to happen. Number one, they have to be intentional about the quarterback situation. And to give you an example, last year, Atlanta got crushed for taking a quarterback at number 8, Michael Penix, when they had just signed Kirk Cousins to a 2-year, $90 to $100 million deal. And I thought it was my favorite pick in the draft because finally an NFL team was being intentional about the future of the toughest position to play in pro sports. And that ended up being correct when you saw Kirk Cousins and his Achilles and how he played, and Penix came in and played pretty well. But the point was they had the guts to make that move at number 8. Now, I'm not saying Seattle has to do anything this year. It's not a great quarterback class. But they've got to be intentional about their future at that position. And then number 2, I saw something the other day about how Seattle's only invested one top 50 pick in the offensive line in the last 8 drafts. And I'm assuming that would be your left tackle, Cross.
Yeah.
So I kind of look at the hire with the offensive coordinator and the ability to marry the run and pass games together. And I go, if you guys don't fix that offensive line over the next 2 years, it isn't really going to matter who your wide receivers are. So from my perspective this year, it's more like, okay, we got to start thinking about quarterback heavily. And number 2, we better fix that offensive line over the next 2 years. And to me, it's an infusion of young guys at high level.
So talking to Mike Mayock here, if you are thinking and trying to be intentional about the quarterback position, I love everything you just said. And I'm a guy who's been sitting here for the last year plus saying I think they should trade DK Metcalf to try to get more back, to try to fix the offensive line, to try to get even more dominant up front on defense, and yes, to eventually address the quarterback position. If you know that this isn't a great class for quarterbacks and you're trying to be intentional, would you try to use your DK Metcalf asset to try to get a second first-round pick in next year's draft to give you more of an opportunity in what could or should be a better quarterback draft?
Again, I'm going to vacuum here a little bit with what they might get, but what I would tell you is that typically, if you ask for a pick a year later, there's in other words, if you were going to get a 2 this year for DK,
yep,
somebody might give you that same team might give you a 1 next year.
I do that in a hurry
because of the discount over the 1 year, right? So if they're at the point now where we're, quote, in that kind of restructure mode, then yeah, I think DK Metcalf becomes an intriguing chess piece to try and generate more draft capital.
Mike, how many days in the calendar year when you were the GM of the Raiders did you field calls from agents saying, my player wants more?
It's such a hard thing because that's part of it, okay? It's part of it. I mean, but also part of it is knowing when to say no. And what's become popular is the Mike Tomlin, we don't want prisoners, we want volunteers. And I get that. And he's right. But you also have to field a football team, which means like Cleveland looks at Myles Garrett and says, I don't want to get rid of Myles Garrett. We're 2 years removed from 11 wins. And Seattle was 10-7 last year. Yep. And you're kind of going, okay, you just cut 5 guys, 5 vets. Are you going to trade this guy? What are you going to do with Font at tight end? So there's so much goes on that fans don't think that much about. The general manager's day is a long day, and it's 365 days a year. And John's got some real tough decisions coming up. But I don't think you can't fix it all this year. This is going to be a couple-year process.
Well, it's interesting you say that, and it kind of leads into a conversation Brock and I have, it feels like constantly, which is as a GM, it feels like it's not that hard to get good, but it's really hard to get great. How much time does a GM spend trying to figure out how to go from good to great, and what kind of risks do you have to take in order to do it?
Really good conversation. And let me ask you guys a question, and I'm going to let you both answer. If Washington had Sam Howell at quarterback this year, how far would they have gotten?
Not very.
Wouldn't have been a playoff team.
Okay. So I love their new GM. I think Adam is outstanding. And I love their head coach. Dan is outstanding. And they drafted really well, and they signed about 7 starters in free agency, kind of, mid-level starters, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of which was done really, really well. But without Jaden Daniels, they don't go to the anywhere near the NFC Championship game. So my point is, and I've had this conversation with a bunch of GMs and coaches and scouts, and it's kind of like if you don't have a franchise quarterback, you're basically just another day closer to getting fired.
Well, so I agree with all that. Again, I feel like we're very much on the same page, which is great. And that leads back into the conversation about Geno Smith, because in my view, he's a good quarterback. I don't know if he's in that Jaden Daniels conversation you're talking about. I don't know. Yeah, I think that to use the Commanders as an example, they're a playoff team with Geno last year. I don't know if they're an NFC Championship team with Geno the way they were with Jaden Daniels. So how do you approach a negotiation with a quarterback like Geno at age, 35, knowing that he's good, but not necessarily in that elite category?
Yeah, and I call that a bridge. And basically, if we were honest, how many franchise quarterbacks are in today's NFL? I would tell you 6 or 7. And then there's a group of another 7, 8, 9 guys that are good football players, but they're not franchise quarterbacks. And Geno would be in that group. And I define that group as guys that are good football players that need a lot of help to get you to a Super Bowl, whereas the franchise guys can get you there themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So,
can you pay one of those good guys $40 million a year?
Well, I had Derek Carr, okay, and I thought John Gruden did a great job getting the most out of Derek Carr that he's ever gotten out of in his career. But I can tell you that I had a bunch of phone calls from teams around the league that wanted Derek Carr and were willing to give up more than a first-round pick, okay? But I couldn't walk into John's office and say, hey, I just traded Derek, because he'd look at me straight in the eye and he'd say, well, who's starting on September 5th next year? Who's under center? And if you don't have an answer for that, you can't do anything about it. So when you say Geno's a good football player, he is. He's solid. At age 35, is he a guy to build around to win a Super Bowl down the road? No, I don't think so. So that's what I mean by being intentional. Next year's draft potentially could have more quarterbacks in it. But I think John's one of the most competent GMs out there, and I would trust that they're having those conversations right now. And Geno's a really good bridge. You're going to pay him. I think he's got 15 in non-guaranteed dollars this year, along with a bonus of about the same. He's 31 million this year, I believe. Mm-hmm. None of it guaranteed until the roster bonus hits later this month. So I think he's a really good bridge, because I don't think you're winning a Super Bowl this year anyway, but you better figure the rest of it out as far as that position in the next year or two.
Mike, so good, and so appreciate all of this time. I got a couple just last quick questions here for you. Kind of big picture, because I sat in that broadcast booth over the last 19 years as well, and I'm going to jump into doing some high school coaching this fall, which is going to be an absolute blast, and make that transition. As you transitioned from the broadcast booth that you were in for so many years into that GM office, what were things you learned that may have surprised you, that you just didn't necessarily, and now in the rearview mirror, you look back and go, wow, that was quite a learning experience?
Yeah, there were so many things. And the first one would be that I spent 20-some years where my job was to be in all 32 NFL buildings when I was with the NFL Network. And I was in all 32 buildings. I had really good relationships. I learned a lot about what I thought was the culture of winning, versus there is a culture of losing also. And one of the best coaches in the history of the game told me about 20 years ago, I said, how many teams do you worry about every year? And he said, maybe 6 or 7. And I said, why so few? He said, Mike, the other 25 will eliminate themselves. And that's so true. And that's one of my big takeaways is we made some mistakes that I kind of felt like at the time were going to be mistakes, and you can't help yourself. And I think one of the things that the goal is to sustain excellence. And if you want to do that in the league, and there aren't many teams, look at Baltimore. Look at, Pittsburgh. Those two teams, and they've had two GMs and two head coaches in the last 25 years. Hire good people, give them the assets to do the job, and leave them alone. And then, kind of lastly, if you want to sustain success, the owners themselves are kind of an unknown entity. They're all a little different. Then there's the head coach GM relationship, which I can't emphasize enough. You got to be on the same page philosophically. And then you need the franchise quarterback. If you can line those three things up, like, say, Detroit has, you got a hell of a shot.
Yeah. What'd you learn about John Schneider during that time and working with him, negotiating with him, talking to him? What did you learn about John as a peer?
Smart, level-headed, always picks the phone up, always looking to make sure that he's on top of everything that he needs to be on top of, not afraid to pull a trigger. We did a couple deals together. It was Gabe Jackson, the guard. I always liked working with John. Even when I was at NFL Network, I just thought he was a very smart, very respectful. People are drawn to him. He's a good leader. There aren't that many people around the league that have been in that chair as long as he has, and I give him a lot of credit.
Okay, and then last thing for me, and I loved the way you kind of summed that up of, 6 or 7 franchise guys, 7 to 9 kind of bridge guys, John Gruden giving you his eyebrow. If you're going to move on from a bridge guy, that better have something in place.
Let's be clear, he's giving you the chin, not the eyebrow.
The chin,
okay.
The double eyebrow, whatever scowl he's going to give you. Is there a possible franchise quarterback in this draft? If there was a controlled alt-delete and reset with Geno and DK for these Seahawks, and you were just to really move on with a new offensive staff, with a defense and run game, is there a franchise future quarterback in this upcoming draft in April?
I'm sure you have your opinions, Brock. I like this Cam Ward guy intrigues me. I don't know how much you saw him at Washington State.
A couple times. Yep.
What I like about Cam Ward is his journey. The kid came out of high school with nothing and goes to Incarnate Word for 2 years, then 2 at Washington State, then Miami. I don't even know who this kid is, and I put the tape on. And after the first tape, at the bottom of my notes, I just wrote "wow" in big letters. And which mostly because in today's world of lateral passing attacks, this kid's the most aggressive by far quarterback that I've seen in this draft. He wants to push it down the field. He believes in his athletic ability. He extends plays. But if you look at his interception reel, I think there were 7 of them. I would probably put a minimum of 5 and probably 6 of the 7 on him being too aggressive.
Yep.
And I'd rather have a kid be more aggressive and hopefully coach that out of him. But that always isn't the case. Look at Jameis Winston. So I like Cam Ward. This Tyler Shuck kid is making me do some more work on him. I watched him against BC and Notre Dame yesterday and came away with pretty impressed with him. And Sanders reminds me a little. Sanders and Dart remind me a little bit of Bo Nix, where if you put them in the right system with the right coach, they're smart. I think they anticipate, they're good decision makers, and you can trust them with the football. So that's my way of avoiding your question.
Thank you.
It's very well done.
You did it very well.
And just
like
because
you were GM.
I feel like I have to ask this. We had all this other stuff come up, but I think the reason we initially asked if you would come on today is so we could ask you about this 18th pick and all the offensive linemen. And, here we are 20 minutes in, but, do you have a favorite offensive lineman, especially interior offensive lineman, that you think is a good fit for this Kubiak system in Seattle at 18?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple names. I love Armand Membu, who's a tackle at Mizzou that can. And the fun, I never even heard of him. Put the tape on. I was like, oh my goodness, is this kid good? And since then he's risen up through the process. But he can play right tackle or inside. He's a great fit for outside zone and play action and what they're going to do. I think Zabel and Gray Zabel, North Dakota State, and Donovan Jackson can both play in that system. But 2 guys that I think are day 2 picks that I really am intrigued by for Seattle would be Tate Ratledge from Georgia, who played on a bad ankle a lot of the year and I thought got a bum rap from a lot of draft nicks. And then he went out to the combine and ran like 4.96 or something, jumped out of the gym, had the second fastest 10-yard dash. He fits what you're trying to do. He's tough as nails. And Marcus Bowe from Purdue, another guy that I think is got great feet and fits what you're trying to do. So there's 4 or 5 names right there for you.
There we go.